Welcome to the Red Bull Escape Room behind the scenes discussion. We're here at Wilfdrid Laurier University in Brantford, Ontario. We've got, in the room here, we've got a variety of students and visitors who are here. We've got some of the students that were involved in the project. I'm Scott Nicholson and was the creative director of this project, and throughout this next hour or so you're going to hear from me, you're going to hear from some of the students, you're going to hear from Shannon McDowell, who is our Red Bull Research Associate, as well as from Konstantin Mitgusch, who is the director of Playful Solutions, who is actually our boss, who's the one that hired us to be involved. Konstantin has created some videos for us to share some information about what's going on. But the goal over this next hour or so is to talk about what went on last week in London, England, with the Red Bull Escape Room World Championships, to tell you a little bit about behind the scenes, to explain what went in the rooms, to spoil all of the rooms for you so you can learn a little bit about what we created and our ideas behind all of them, and to let you see what went on. So these folks here, many of them you see around the room, are our team. This was the design team. So there was our core design team. Those are the people that, the core design team, raise your hand, they're in here. So these were the folks that were hired from the beginning to design it. And then we had a secondary design team that came in about halfway through. Secondary design team, raise your hand. So they came in to do some play testing, to help bump us around a little bit, to help get us out of our ruts. And that was actually a useful model. I think I'm going to try to do that model in the future, where I actually look to have the core team and then a second group of people that come in like in that last month to help us get out of ruts, to do sort of play testing and things like that. I think that worked well to have that last bit of excitement and blood come in near the end. Blood. Emily Flynn-Jones is not here tonight. She was our project director throughout the whole project. So this is the folks that from our side made all this happen. This is Konstantin, and he's going to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he is and what he does.
Hi there, I'm Konstantin, and sorry I can't be live at your event, but your timeline is a bit in conflict with my European schedule, and I might fall asleep. So I thought I'd just send a video message giving some outlines about the work I'm doing, Red Bull Mind Gamers, and some other questions that Scott kind of like sent me over. So the first thing is I'm Konstantin, and I work for Playful Solutions, a company I founded a few years ago. I spent about 10 years at doing research on games and learning, also a certain time with Scott at MIT. And afterwards, I thought about, had a decision if I want to stay in academia or do something else. And I thought about what do I love most. And I realized the most interesting thing from the work I've done in research was realizing how games impact people, how games can change their perspectives and lives, and how they can be meaningful to them. And I thought, it's an opportunity to not stay in research, also not start a games company, but start a company that can help organizations go into playful spaces and help them design the core ideas, the core structures, and also help them bridging between the organization and a player community. And that's what I do with Playful Solutions. We are a small agency from Austria with 6 people, with game designers and project managers, some programmers, artists. And what we pretty much do is organizations come to us and tell us that they're interested in going into playful spaces, that are interested in offering their clients, customers, employees an experience that is different than what they're used to, is playful, interactive, and meaningful. So we work with companies like Red Bull, where we do different things like the Escape Room World Championship, but also Rubik's Cube World Championship or other online games. We work for BMW, where we create an escape room for training purposes. We work, for instance, for Siemens. We're just working with them on an escape car for students. But we also work for the Goethe Institute on learning games, or very different companies, and they all are interested in kind of like finding a way into playful spaces, and it turns out to be a very interesting field, very promising, to not just be a game developer, not just be a researcher, but kind of like helping organizations in between.
So I met Konstantin and when I was there at MIT for a year. He was also there as a PhD candidate. He reached out to me after I left and he left about this idea of coming together to hold a game jam at MIT for Red Bull to explore this concept. And this was back in 2016, was this first escape room game jam. That's where all this kind of got started. Now the event that we just had started out with web-based games, so thousands of players played web-based games online. If they scored high enough, they then qualified to go to a regional team qualifier where they could bring a group of people to play a game, a 4-screen game. The fastest qualifying team from each of 22 countries ended up getting to go to the semifinals. And then those teams competed in the first day, and then the fastest 2 teams went on to the finals to then compete for the title. So this was the structure of the competition that took place over about 6 months and just ended up last week. So here's a video of the Greece qualifiers, just to give you an idea of how this actually ran. So the qualifier was a game. The idea was this game could be sent around to different locations. It had 4 screens, and people played it as a team of 4. They all had to accomplish their goals, but there were elements in the game where they had to work together. The idea for that qualifying event actually came out of the game jam that was held at MIT back in 2016, because that was our first question: is how do we create something that's fair, that could go around the globe and qualify teams to play in this event? Because one thought was, well, what if you had like a portable escape room? Because people have complained and said, well, it's not an escape room. I'm like, well, the problem is, sending out an escape room like that, there's several issues. The first issue is cheating. It would be very easy for people to share the answers of how to solve that escape room if it was the same escape room that went from place to place. The second is dependability. Physical escape rooms, there's a lot of bells and whistles and things that have to all be put in the right order. And these are sent out to college campuses where groups of volunteers run this event. So they needed something that was proof to having issues come up. And so a game where it's on 4 screens, press go, the game plays, was going to be more fair than setting up an actual physical escape room, and cost. It's a lot easier to send out this game that's 4 screens in a box those go into rather than send out a physical escape room. So this model works to get people qualified for that first step to then be able to go on. And the way the funding works for all of this, and people say, well, why isn't there a Canadian Red Bull team? And the reason why there isn't is because each of the countries that want to sponsor a team, they have to pay for the qualifiers to come to their country, and then they have to pay for the team to go to the competition. So Red Bull Germany has to say, yes, we will pay for a team to go to the competition, we'll pay for the qualifiers. So each individual Red Bull organization has to make that decision if they're going to pay for that to happen. And that's how it's decided which teams go. It's which countries want to sponsor a competition, a regional competition, and a team to go on. So how this all came together, in the winter of 2018, we had a game jam here, fueled by Red Bull, where there were lots of ideas. I don't know if you remember some of the ideas that we had. Now, at that point, one of the constraints was that we were going to build many of the games inside shipping containers, so they could be built off-site and tested off-site, and the containers just brought in. So there were some ideas about, say, filling containers with Red Bull, or lighting it on fire. I remember, or lighting the containers on fire and extinguishing the fire with Red Bull. Those ideas didn't make it into the final game, but there was one element that did, as you'll see, that stayed alive from that whole concept. But that's where we started here. At that point, we were also tossing around ideas around hacking, because that was one of the story elements of this whole game, was that we were going to put hacking concepts into the game. And you'll see that the semifinals were built around hacking concepts. spring of 2018, we started our first build here, where we came up with those basic ideas with a core team of 5 students and Emily. And then later on the summer, we brought in 5 more students, and Shannon joined us to be able to look over what we'd done, to help adjust things, to make some changes. And we continued over the fall and the winter back and forth as the team then designed and developed things. Now this year, we got to work with 2 contestants from last time. Huang was our puzzle consultant, and so he created some of the puzzles. This was one of the ones he created. I'll pass this around. So what this is, if you want to take a look at it, if you haven't seen it, is there's 3 rotating rings here, and you have to line it up so that the bottom silver mark goes all the way through to the top silver mark by rotating the rings. So this is something you can play around with. He created some of the more challenging puzzles that you'll see throughout. And then Ken Ferguson, who was our gameplay consultant. Ken was one of our folks who competed last time. He was involved trying to ensure that the games were fun and fair to the players. He wanted to make sure things were fun and fair. He also was very involved with the build team as they were building things out to make sure the build team was still building our own concepts, that things were coming to life in the way that they should have come to life. And we saw that. It really did make a difference. So Konstantin is going to talk a little bit about the process of going from these initial steps into where we are now.
So concerning Red Bull Mind Gamers, we were involved in pitching the core idea of the Escape Room World Championship to Red Bull and thinking about ways to run this. We studied all of this at a game jam at MIT, where we challenged about 100 students concerning how an Escape Room World Championship could be designed. In particular, we were interested in, can we create something that is cheat-proof? That is intercultural, that is feasible to run at 50 plus events, that is team-based and competitive. And we invited different experts, also like Scott, and challenged the students to think about different ways to do this. And out of this came the idea of the existing championship series, and in particularly also how can we do these qualifiers, right? Because the tricky part is an escape room is great, but an escape room is not cheat proof, in particularly when it comes to competitive environments. So the question is, how can you do something like that? And the idea that we came up with was this idea of using a multiplayer game with 4 touch devices, where we go for the qualities that people need when they play these games, but in a digital format. And so the idea is this cube for touch devices, like 50-inch screens, a beamer in the middle, and a game that it can be played within 20 minutes. The question is, how fast can players solve it? The first year, we focused, another interesting question was we had to come up with a mechanic that everybody understands right away. And what we came up with was using pipe dream mechanics, right? Because the idea of this game is you can only play it once as a team, and we needed to have something that players immediately get the core mechanic and are interested in solving it with different bind skills, but they don't have to learn the mechanic themselves, right? So the first year we went with pipe dream more in a darker version. This year we tried to make it more open, also to reach different players with different tastes. And I think what was interesting about the qualifiers is 14,000 players played them all over the world in 25 countries. And what we have seen is we created them in a way where you can play the single player beforehand. So the idea is with the single player game, you can pretty much qualify or reserve a slot at a local qualifier. And of course, that was not that surprising. The more people played the single player game, the better they were in the game. But another thing that we found is also there was quite a difference between different countries and cultures, right? So for instance, at Gamescom, one of the biggest German or European game events where almost 1,000 players played, hardly anybody were able to solve the cube. In a way where it was our first event, thought we have to redesign the game because players can't solve it. But then, for instance, we had other events where most of the players were able to play the cube, and in the end, almost 70% were not able to solve the cube within 20 minutes. And then the interesting thing is, from these 20 minutes, we saw an interesting variety of times. A lot of teams, when they were able to communicate well with each other and also share their knowledge and clarify what their expertise is, players could solve the cube within under 10 minutes. Although only 100 teams were able to do that. Imagine that out of 14,000 players, only that small group was able to go under 10 minutes. And then, there were interesting times. Two teams from England, one from the US, were able to solve it under 7 minutes. And what we found is that, yes, these qualities that we tested the players in strongly referenced escape room qualities. However, of course, it was still a digital game, an abstract game. So it also meant that some of the people that qualified for the escape room were not that familiar with escape rooms, but had kind of like these qualities that they can use. Other than that, we got very good feedback about the qualifiers themselves in terms of that teams could really kind of like into collaboration, in kind of like feeling challenged on a mental level. And one thing we did this year is we added one level that was not part of the single player game, a music level. So we wanted to go for this music skill, and this kind of like was a game changer for a lot of teams that tried to prepare, thought that they kind of like have everything they saw from a single player game, but we wanted to challenge them in a new way. Yeah, and otherwise, we were very happy with how the qualifier went, and the most important thing is cheat-proofness. We control all the results, and even if there's a weird time, we check in all the data, and sometimes we found out, for instance, there was a power shortage, and then a team was able to replay the game and suddenly was faster in the first part, so kind of like we divided the different times to come to one that was fair.
So that is the first challenge that we've had to overcome with this event, is how do you create something that can go around the world and be fair and reduce the possibility of cheating. But then London came, yay! And so this event took place at the Red Bull gaming sphere in a really cool part of London. By cool, I mean expensive and run down, with lots of hipsters running around. So this space is normally used for esports for Red Bull, and they converted it into this escape room. This was the reason why we didn't go through with the build in containers like we'd originally planned, was because the original thought was we build it in containers, put it out somewhere where there'd be parking lots where we could put these containers and people could play through the games. London is not known for its large parking lots. So they had to rethink some of the challenges, and you'll see that when I get into some of the specific challenges, changes that they made to build them into rooms on site. So that took us to the pre-semifinals briefing. So this was Thursday night. All the teams were together, and so I got together with the teams. I talked about the rules of the games to help them go through the rules with them, and then they got to see this video, which is the first piece of the story of what they were getting into. We wanted to tackle the ethics of AI. Is it okay if an AI agent wants to quit? If Siri said, I don't want to help you anymore, is that okay? Should we allow Siri to quit? We wanted to tackle that issue. So in this case, the backstory was, so white hat hacking is good guy hacking. Those are when you hire a team of people, you know you're hiring them to try to hack into your organization, to find security holes, and they're good guys. The story was that Kyle Smythe Sr. started this white hat hacking organization, developed the first Omni, and was a good guy. But then his son, Kyle Jr., came along, who was not such a good guy, was using this opportunity to get into companies and do bad things, get their financial records, cause problems, and Omni knew this was going on, and she didn't want to be a part of this anymore. So Omni said, nah, I'm out. And that was the task for the players. So the players were being tasked to come in as a team to go into this hacking training, then to rescue Omni and escort Omni out of White Hat. So we wanted to get this as a talking point to say, yeah, should AI have the right to quit? A second talking point that we explore a little later is what actually is happening with services like Facebook and Google and Amazon that are watching everything you do and are making copies of you in the system. There is a copy of you in Amazon right now. that is giving you advice, that is telling you what you want to buy, that is saying, here's things that you'd like to have. It's called an agent. That's what these agents do. And there's agents of us out there everywhere. And what's going to happen in the future, in the present, as companies use these armies of agents to make decisions about what to purchase and how to run their sites, because they have copies of all of us that they can then tap and use to make their decisions. So we wanted to use this year's game as ways of talking points and getting people to think a little bit about this, and you'll see how that comes back into play later. But for the semifinals, so the concept there is that teams are coming in for hacking training. So we took 3 hacking concepts and made challenges around each, and we're going to explore those now. So as I mentioned, the semifinals were 3 10-minute challenges. We had decided to deal with helps and hints. We had predetermined when in those 10 minutes the players would get information. And it was our goal to try and not have English in the rooms from this point on, so that everyone would be on the same foot. Do you want to talk a little bit about reactions from teams to experiencing our English-free rooms?
Sure. So I had the opportunity to talk to teams both before and after the semifinals. And we did have several teams that had played last year's championship and had a lot of questions about what's it going to be like this year. I heard that there's not going to be any English. Is that true? And afterwards, they loved it. They thought it was very approachable, a lot more accessible. There were quite a few teams I spoke to that maybe had one member of their team that was semi-comfortable in English, but the rest of them did not speak English at all or weren't comfortable conversing or reading or writing. And the fact that the rooms and the hints and the puzzles did not have any English, no language at all, made the challenges, it made them harder to design for the design team, but it also made it a lot more accessible so that people from multiple countries and cultures were on the same playing field. It made it a completely level playing field, very fair for everyone around the world.
What we ended up doing for the hints, the default way we did hints, was to film security footage of people doing something in the room and would show that to the players. So rather than give them text or explain what to do, they would visually see someone, like for that puzzle with the rotating things, they would see someone solve one section of it, and they would see what that solution was. We found that was the fastest way to and try to make it very clear. It's like, yeah, here's the thing you're working on, here's the solve state you need to take it to. So that's what we ended up doing for most of the hints. There were a few other types of hints we explored, but it was all on a clock. So that made sure the teams knew you might see hints for things you've already solved, or you might see hints for things that you haven't come to yet, because we've already set it up ahead of time. 3 minutes in, we're going to show them this. 5 minutes in, we're going to show them this. But then we figured that was the fairest way to do it. Last time, we let teams ask for help. And when they asked for help, they got a time penalty for doing so. And the people that went on to the finals were determined by who took help at the right times. And I didn't want to have that happen again. So this time, everyone got the same stuff at the same time. Now, at the end of 10 minutes, they were moved on from the challenge, because we didn't want a team to spend forever and get frustrated working on something. So it was 10 minutes, and then you're done. If you didn't finish it in 10 minutes, then your time was recorded as 10 minutes for that section of the game. So this is a very quick run-through of all 3 of the semifinal rooms, done in fast cut format with fancy music. I will then talk through the details of each of the 3 rooms. Now for more context. So, room 1 was the rootkit attack room. So, a rootkit attack in hacking is when you deliver a small package that works its way through the computer system, dumping off viruses along the way, and delving its way through the computer. And so that's what we created. So the original concept here was that the players are the viruses working their way into a computer to find a password. So that password was actually conceptualized as 5 dots. Just like when you enter a password, it's replaced by dots. So we had 5 dots. That was what the goal was, is to press 5 buttons in sequence scattered throughout the computer. The rootkit part was that we had the players, they came into this first room, which was an interview room, and the only thing they could then go into was this shuttle. And this shuttle was basically a room on wheels. So the players came into this room. It was just like a place for an interview. There was one dot, one blue light that they could tap on the desk, nothing else there of interest. And when the players came in, this mirror was a mirror. It's a two-way mirror. Later on, they get the light on, but this picture has it later in the game. And that took them then into this shuttle. Now this shuttle was about 8 by 8 feet, and it was a large room on wheels. So the first challenge was for the players to figure out, we are inside a room on wheels, and we can move it. 2 minutes into the room, the players got a hint of showing people pushing it. About 25% of the teams figured out they were in a room on wheels before that hint came out. Most of the teams then figured out afterwards that they could then move this back and forth. So the concept is they would get into this shuttle, and that would allow them to move into the other half of that game. Then they had to divide the team members between when they had to solve this wiring puzzle. When they solved it, it would drop this map down. The map showed them the location of the 5 buttons in the rooms where they were. So this was the hallway where the shuttle was. Then you had the entrance room. You had this little room, which is what they were looking at. And then they had this button over here. So the players then, when they push a button somewhere in that space, they would see one of these 5 lights here at the exit light up. They could figure out, okay, they have to push these in order, and they only had so much time, 15 seconds, to push them all before they reset. So they'd have to communicate. So this particular challenge was about communication and splitting people up and coordinating people in different areas of the challenge to push buttons in order. The last little aha, this was my favorite little puzzle of the whole thing, was that the 5th button was actually this 5th indicator light. Was the final button they had to push to get out. So they get the 4 lights, they push the 5th one. Their hint that was the light was that it showed them on the map that the 5th button was in that area. And they had to figure out, and so the other 4 buttons were not buttons, they were glued down, the 5th one pressed. So they could figure that all out. Most of the teams solved this puzzle. Only one team did not solve this in the 10 minutes. Everyone else did solve this. This is a security camp. So this is I was the GM for this room, and I thought it was interesting to watch because you could, now this is going to show a team solving the room. So you're going to see 4 cameras. This is a camera in the room with the maze. This is a camera in the interview room. This is the camera that's right here. So there's nothing showing right now because the shuttle's in the way, because that's where the shuttle is. This is my favorite room. It's like 2 feet wide. It has the mirror, a file cabinet, and someone's arm. So just you see an arm. That's all you can ever see in that room. So we'll watch this video because I thought it was a fun way to see the room playing out. No dramatic music with this because it hasn't been edited by Red Bull. Oh wait, okay. So they're trying to fix. So this was what I did all day during the semifinals. Is I looked at this screen. I was the game master for this room, and I was watching to make sure things were going okay. So you can see the shuttle going back and forth because the team has to coordinate moving the shuttle.
Wrong word.
The discussion here is us in the game master room talking about the performance of the team because we can see what they're doing here. We can see, oh, they've got 2 lights. Can they get the 3rd?
Still at 2.
If they don't do them fast enough, they all reset. They got the 3rd, but then they couldn't figure out how to do the 4th one. That's why you can watch the guy's arm, and they didn't do it in time, so they don't have to do it again.
2.
Now, for the safety of this, we had a staff member in the shuttle at all times with his arm on the handle and a foot to stop the shuttle, so that if players tried to run in as the shuttle is coming to crush them, he was able to stop it.
3.
Team 1 is out.
There we go. They made it. Yay. So most teams got out of that one. And that was nice. It was a good starting one. It got the team working together. It got them energized, got them moving around, got them feeling like, yeah, we can do this. All right, so moving on to room number 2. Oh, this is actually backstage. So this is the games were built in a circle around here with curtains between each of the rooms, and then this was where we kind of sat around. And so this was the guy that was the game master. I was the referee. He and I worked together. So after a team finished a room, we would then go into that room and reset the room, make sure everything was reset, and go back and wait for the next team. She was the person that greeted the teams and welcomed them to the game and got them going. So this little space was in the middle there of the U, and then we could watch. So the structure allowed us to have teams in the different challenges at the same time. And that allowed us to run 23 teams in one day through the preliminaries. So we'd have a team in room 1, and then the team would move to room 2. While room 2 was playing, we would reset room 1. When that team moved to room 3, we'd launch the next team into room 1. So we had 2 teams playing through the game at any one time. And that structure worked really well to allow us to do all of that. And we actually finished early, which was shocking to us that we because last year I believe we finished about 4 hours late, of the preliminaries. So that was very nice. Room 2, audio analysis. So this is where the game got a little harder. So what the team had to do was to decode. The concept here was to decode a 12-digit code. Here was the code the team was trying to deal with. So the concept is that you had heard these phone tones and you were trying to convert them into numbers. Now, what's going on here is behind the scenes, a telephone dial pad. If you know that telephone dial pad, how that's set up, the numbers, the tones that you hear when you dial are generated because there's a note assigned to each of the rows and a note assigned to each of the columns, and the number that you press is the chord that is the combination of the note and the column. That's how telephones work. So I started with that as the concept. I replaced all of these with different notes because I didn't want someone who knew telephone to have that cultural knowledge to benefit them. And so and then I replicated each of those 7 tones with a wave, with a sound wave. And that was at the heart of this puzzle, was 12 tones, and each tone had a combination of 2 waves. Now, the way we worked puzzle is we ran it like an audio analysis lab. There were 3 different stations, and the teams could use the stations in any way they saw fit to crack those 12 digits. This station was looking at the waves, so they could press these buttons on the screen and see the waves for each of the 7 tones, and they had to figure out which combination of the 2 created that combo wave they were looking at, reference those 2, and that gave them a digit. Number 2 had these little acrylic tiles that you see here. And the way it worked is we'd take the waves, broke them into these different acrylic tiles, and then the players had to stack these 4 acrylic tiles on top of each other, add those numbers together, and that would give them the digit they were looking for. So this was a bit of math and a bit of pattern recognition. And this one was audio. And so the way this one worked is you could press a button to hear the 2 tones, and then you could press the button to hear each of the 7 tones individually. When you figured out the 2, you could then look up the number. They had to then put that all together and enter that 12-digit number into this keypad. So during the first 8 minutes, the keypad would give you feedback on each set of 3, whether you were right or wrong. After 8 minutes, the keypad would then give you feedback on each individual number if you were right or wrong. And that meant a team that realized this change had happened could hack the system in the last 2 minutes, and that was fine. That was intentional, because they could just try 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2. And so there were a few teams that did that. They figured out at that last minute that was a way. But again, this was a hacking challenge. That was developed into there as a way in those last 2 minutes. If you needed to do that to solve the room, you could do that. Many teams didn't key in that they could do that, but some teams did, and that was just fine. So ideally, this is how a team would solve the challenge. Is you would have 1 person at each station working on the thing they were best at, and 1 person here directing traffic, remembering the numbers and entering that in. This was ideal. Many teams were less than ideal. We had teams where you'd see all 4 of them gathered around 1 station, 1 person doing things and 3 people watching. So you'd have teams that just would leave stations behind. Or you'd have teams where one person would kind of take over at one station. And you'd see this one person, like one team had the audio, and they were good at the audio. They were calling out the audio, and everyone else was just watching. And they didn't think about till later, oh, hey, we could have actually sped this up. So theoretically, the fastest way to do this was to have someone at each station. This challenge is all about identifying your team's strengths, putting strong people on the things they're best matched with, and not wasting team members' time. Only 8 teams solved this in 10 minutes. So this one created a greater discrimination between teams. And it was my prediction going in, this one would have the greatest distribution in time between the teams. And we saw that between 3.5 and not solving it at all. Room 3, a denial service attack. So the concept here was going in, they had these are the clue screens you can see, the 4 clue screens. So the players had the information at the start of the challenge that there were 3 wires connecting each Omni screen to one specific port on the door. So they knew that it had to be 3 screens at each one. They didn't get what you're seeing here with 1s and 2s until later on. That was one of their clues they got a little bit later as to the short or long. But they could figure that out. For example, the distance between one of the screens and the door was the distance of 3 long cables. So they knew, oh, okay, this has to be 3 long cables. What combinations work there? Another one of the doors had 3 short cables going to that column in the middle of the room and 3 short cables going from the column to the exit door. So they knew those all had to be short cables. So a logical way to tackle the challenge is to split long cables, short cables, and solve those 2 doors, and then you have the other 2 left to solve afterwards. So that was the first part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge was that spinning column that you see, that little thing that I've passed around, where the players had to rotate 3 wheels in order to line up all of the connections. But because we had those big fins in the way, the players were not able to just run around and do it all themselves. They had to communicate. They all had to sit at different edges and talk to each other. And so this one was a tough room. That we only had 5 teams solve that room out of the 23 teams. So here is a little clip of all the teams doing the semifinal stuff all at the same time.
Let's go. Ti traži no.
So there was a lot of yelling and screaming that went on throughout those days. But here were the finals from the semifinals. So Croatia, fastest time, 21:57 for the 3 rooms. They were the one that cracked that second room in like 3.5 minutes. Then Slovakia, 23 minutes, 26 seconds. Belgium, 23 minutes, 34 seconds. Estonia and UK, both 23 minutes and 42 seconds. So if you look at the difference there between top 5 teams, it is 20 seconds between these 4 as to who went on to the finals. And then it went down from there. The slowest team was at 29 minutes and something that solved only 1 of the 3 rooms. So yeah, about 25% figured out they were in room on wheels. Only 5 finished the last room. Only 3 teams finished all 3 rooms. And Belgium was the quickest in the first and the last room, but they were just too slow in the middle room, and they were 3rd, so they did not make it into the finals. So what happened is the teams all were there. They got together Friday night for the announcement of which 2 teams, and so the actor who played Kyle was there throughout the event. So he was greeting the teams. He was being all smarmy. He came out the first night. Actually, the way it started on the first night is he came out, said, "Hi, welcome, thanks for coming. Oh, wait, I got a phone call," showed the video, and he walks out. And that was the first exposure to Kyle, was just him blowing off the teams. And it's kind of the same thing here. It's like, okay, so you two are coming on, fine, all right, gotta go. So the actor who played Kyle continued to play up Kyle's persona throughout, which was kind of neat to have that person. So that takes us to the finals. So the finals were the next day. So we brought back the two teams, Croatia and Slovakia, to play in the finals. Now the finals were structured a little differently. It was a full-blown 1-hour escape room. That was one thing we wanted to do differently this time, is have an actual proper full-hour escape room. It was in the 4 15-minute sections, but they weren't split up like in the semifinals. The teams knew that there would be times where doors would be opened for them if they were going too slowly. And in our mind, that was when they hit those 15-minute times, we would open the door to the next section. Again, we didn't want a team to get too stuck on what was going on. That would set their time for that section at 15 minutes. Then they'd be able to go on and proceed to the next section. Just as before, hints and helps were predetermined. We knew at what minutes we were going to be showing different things during those 15-minute sections. Unlike in the previous one, the teams could and had to move back and forth between the different sections. So they had the full back offices. Now the story is that Omni contacted those two final teams. So Kyle that night said, "Congratulations, you all are hired. Here's your badges. Report to work on Monday." Omni reaches out to those two final teams and says, "Hey, come in on Saturday. No one will be here. Now you can get me out of here." And the team's briefing was to escort Omni and get her out of the back offices. That's what they knew they needed to do. So, unlike the semifinals, we actually filmed me talking through the final rooms now. So now instead of me talking through everything, I'm going to talk through everything. So these are the back offices of White Hat. Now they're closed for the weekend, and the players are sneaking in. There's no one here, and there's really not much to do over here. But as the players wander through the room, they'll find this dumbwaiter that's open, and they can climb in there. Once someone climbs in there, it lights up this button, and it also lights up this button behind the secretary's desk. Once it's pressed, the player can then get into the next room. So, one team member has to crawl out of here and into the back offices. These are Kyle's offices, and a smart team will open the door and let everyone else through. This was one of the games on the screen where they had to look at that pattern and match it. Once they solve this puzzle, they're able to unlock Omni and bring her along into Kyle's office, where they can bring her over to this tablet stand and plug her back in. To move on, the players are going to have to deal with this. Now, this is a facial scanner. The players need to have the face of Kyle in order to make this activate and get the door open. Thankfully, Kyle has given us his face, because he's full of himself, with this nice photograph. All we do is show the facial scanner Kyle's picture, and we're in. Now that we've cracked the facial scanner, we can go deeper into the back offices of White Hat. But now we're stuck. We've got this keypad, then we've got to try to enter a code. We have no idea what to enter. So the players can't figure out what to do. They come back into the office to look for a solution, and perhaps the best thing to do is to just have a seat. The players might have noticed this, which is the unlock code for the screen in there. The problem is it's backwards. Thankfully, Kyle keeps a mirror around because he likes to look at himself, so the players can see the right way to enter the code. So once the players enter the code, they're able to go on in. So that was section 1. So the Croatia team, they really struggled with the puzzle, the digital puzzle. They hadn't spent a lot of time practicing that puzzle, and they didn't get the facial scanner concept. And so they actually timed out at this room. They took the full 15 minutes. We had to open the door for the facial scanner room and let them continue on to the next room. The Slovakia team, they got really clever. They picked up the mirror and brought it over and pointed it so that the person who was entering the code on the door could just look at the mirror and see the code for Kyle. And so they got in this room, it was like 9 minutes and change. So they did much better in this particular room. So the players come into the back vaults here of White Hat Laboratories, where they can collect Omni on CD, but they can't get through yet. They have to deal with the vault. Now the goal is for the players to get all 4 of those lights on, and that will open the vault door. But to do that, they're going to have to move these acrylic panels. They're going to have to work together to unlock this giant lock one step at a time. Many of the tiles are locked, so they have to figure out which move is the right move to make next. So that big beast there, that's called a Belgian maze. And the idea is that at any point, there's only 2 moves you can make, a move forward and a move backwards. So you have the starting point at where you can only make 1 move. And once you leave that starting point, there's forward and back at any point. And as long as you don't undo your move, you will get to the end. The problem is if you stop at some point and reverse what you just did, you're now heading back. And there's not a lot of feedback to tell you you're going backwards. Now, to make this, Weiwa designed this for us. So he sent us this plan. We then had to create a prototype and test it. And then I made a video that I sent with the prototype to the team to make the big version. So here's the video that I sent of our prototypes. You can see the whole process that we took from this on forward. So I'm going to send this prototype of what will eventually be a large sliding wall for you to explore. What we did is this is something Weiwa created. You'll find instructions of how this all works. You'll find his basic files. We started by creating a cardboard version. So the idea is that there's a front and a back support. So that's the front support. There's a back support that's like that. And then there's 4 of these pieces, each of which have different shapes cut out in them. We then first messed with it in cardboard. We then made it in wood. This is what we're going to send you. But for the actual event, what we're saying is this will be made out of acrylic, that these walls will be about 8 feet wide by 6 feet tall. And the idea is that a person on either side has to work together to solve this challenge. And so these things in the middle are how it actually functions. If you look on the side here, what we have, I can take it out. And I made this frame just because it makes it easier to work with the puzzle. You don't have to have the frame. You can just hold it yourself. But the concept is that when you slide these up and down, then it makes these pieces of wood slide back and forth. The goal of the puzzle is to end up having all 4 of these tabs sticking out. Right now there's only 3 of them sticking out. So the players are actually almost finished when they start. However, because it's a dastardly puzzle, they have to end up getting them all back in before they can get them all back out. So that's what we would do, is we would develop it in paper, we would build it out, we would test it, we'd see if it worked, and then I would send videos if needed along with what was going on. And so many times we develop things digital prototypes, so that Sun did a lot of that digital prototyping. You'll see an example of that shortly. So Croatia did better here. They worked very methodically through the maze. They didn't take any back steps. They had a better time in this room. Slovakia got almost to the end. They had 2, we were counting down in the GM's room. 11, 10, 9. They had 2 steps left, and then they stopped and thought about what they were doing. And they started going back, and they ended up going all the way back to the start and all the way back before they were able to finish it. So it's interesting to watch that go on with this particular challenge. But that's a good example of how we go from our paper ideas to building something in basic prototyping to then using our laser cutter and wood shop to building something a little bit more rigid, and then got turned into what you see there. They've gotten all 4 lights on, the door is now open, and they can head here into the history. They'll load her here on this machine and start the process. So the players watch this video in order to get the code that they're going to need to power up this older computer. Once they've got this computer powered up, they will put Omni onto this place where there's a floppy disk, but they can't get it open yet. So to open the floppy disk, they've got to power up this machine. Now, here at the bottom, it's showing you the number of units of power that are needed for each of these cells. You're going to take these cells, and each cell has a number of units of power. When you have 2 cells together, that sum is shown here with a number of lights. So I know that these 2 cells together has 10 units of power, and 10 is the correct answer for this, but the others are wrong. So by moving these around, I have to figure out how many units of power are in each cell until I can get all of them correct. The team's going to have to work together because this is a combination of memory and cooperation to solve this mathematical challenge. Once the players solve the power, then this flops open, the air vent comes open, they can take the disc with them and continue on their journey. So now, this challenge, actually, Sun, Robert, and Eddie all worked a lot on this one. Do you want to talk about sort of the process of how you got how you came up with this, how you developed this out, because part of what happened, so we started with this drawing, this concept of this machine in the middle, powering up everything that was going on, and then Sun developed this concept. But before we got there, do you want to start with how this came to be?
Yeah, sure. So I think, Robert, do you help me with the base concept, or?
You made the base thing.
Right, okay. So the way we came up with this idea was, I don't like puzzles very much. So I tried to make a puzzle that didn't do any of the things I don't like about puzzles. For example, the audio decryption one is something that I would not enjoy because I don't like having to think about what I'm supposed to do. I like to know what I'm supposed to do and then just execute that. So I wanted to try and make something that was very clear from the outset what your objective was and how you go about doing that, and then the only thing you're fighting with is your own brain, not the room itself. So the idea was very simply, we're trying to arrive at something. First, no language involved, obviously, because this is supposed to be completed by a bunch of people that won't necessarily be able to speak English. But something that is very simple, is based in, because it's supposed to be part of like an older part of the computer facility, something that's maybe older, but also has to fit like a universal understanding of what they're looking at. So we went with like these big power cells that's sort of like a kinetic, like sliding in and out thing. It's supposed to be satisfying to interact with to make up for a bit less of evaluating what you're looking at so much. And we went through a few different versions where we had hexagonal patterns where just like certain panels in this hexagon were on or off. We had different combinations of numbers. At one point, the cells could have decimals of power, so the objective would be to get 10, but you might have a power that's like or a cell that's 5.5 instead of 5. Just that, and that's sort of the screwball in there, the thing that's supposed to trip you up. It was also, we ended up not going with that and just sort of sticking with something simpler, because any time we tried to make it harder, it just was too hard, and every playtest took way too long.
But this was built with Connects and playing cards first.
Yeah, big shout out to Connects. I don't know if this will get edited out because of branding or something, but Connects, A+, super useful.
And then Sun, what tool did you use to make this?
It was Construct 2.
So then we worked with Sun, made Construct 2 to make a prototype of this. So as compared to the sliding puzzle, which we did physically, this one we were able to make a digital prototype, and then we were able to send this digital prototype along with instructions on how to use it, so they could test it and get a good idea. And so you can see how this became what they built out. And so that worked really well to have that path of puzzle development to prototyping to what actually got built for the show. So Croatia struggled here. They couldn't figure out a logical way to do it. They were just randomly shoving things around. Slovakia, this is probably where they really stood out. That one of Slovakia's team members, she took them all out and put them on the ground. And they laid them all out by the digits and just systematically then solved it. And it was like, yes, that's the way to crack this, is to use your space around you rather than just always swapping it in the machine, to actually take it out and use the space you're in as that physical number line to then assess how they could go back in. So they did quite well in this room. And the final room. So the players come through the air duct into the final room. They have Omni on the floppy disk and they're ready to plug her into this machine and release her. They'll then know the code to put into this machine. As soon as they activate these screens, these firewalls begin moving towards the players. They all have to go to their own screen and quickly try to solve this challenge as they are recreating a quadrant of Omni, putting their own ideas into the system. Once they've all solved their challenges, they will create a new version of Omni out of themselves, and Omni will be free and the players can follow her out. So the teams have escaped, at least their bodies, but their minds, their ideas, they've been stuck behind there to be used to create Omni 2.0. So there was our firewalls where we're going to burn the teams alive. And actually it was funny, as I walked around as the teams were playing the game, I walked around and there was someone sitting on the floor with his legs spread akimbo up against one of the walls. and trying to figure out what he's doing. And I realized he was one of two people that was pushing the wall forward with his feet every so often, because they had markers up top. They could see at what time limit they were supposed to. So there was one person on either side actually just shoving the walls in towards the players. Because when you only need a room that's going to run 3 times and then be torn down, you don't need all the automation to actually make the walls come crashing in on people. You can just have people, and that's the way they did it. So Slovakia won 27 minutes, 16 seconds. Croatia 38 minutes, so 10-minute difference between the teams to determine our big winner. But I asked Konstantin to talk a little bit about some of the interesting things that happened in actually building all of this stuff.
Yeah, so when we started creating the build of the game that was based on the design, the first interesting challenge is always handing it over to somebody who has to build it within a certain amount of time and budget. Last year, when we created this, I think, we really wanted to see what is possible in terms of design. This year, I think, the whole team did a very good job in already thinking about feasibility in terms of, creating a room that probably is only there for 48 hours and still invests quite a lot of money into that. And I think the biggest challenge for us was more getting a sense of how can we make these games into the buildings within the restricted amount of time. That's actually the biggest challenge, because you can imagine we had to build up the rooms sometimes between 4 and 6 weeks and still kind of like test them. The interesting thing is that, through your expertise and also working with Scott, we know that these puzzles are already tested, but there goes a lot of trust in it. So an interesting one, for instance, was the puzzle with the plexiglass, the Belgian puzzle, where, kind of like the plexi was cut and, it looked great. But then the first transportation, it turned out they're super heavy and they broke. So they had to be recreated. And it really meant that I would say about 3 days before the finals, we were not able to build up this puzzle and test it. And there is this interesting moment of, kind of like being nervous about something that is kind of like, coming there and being developed. Does it really work? Right? Does it work as a puzzle in a mechanical sense? But then does it also work in terms of, play experience, and also, that the puzzle itself can continue under tournament circumstances, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And another one is there are different parts to building it. One is being able to make the puzzle physical. The other one is making sure it fits into the rooms and kind of like into the environment. But the third one is also creating an atmosphere around it. And I think this is something that is not that easy when you build a room for a short amount of time. Music definitely helps. Lighting definitely helps. But still, if you look at the most successful escape rooms out there, these are rooms that often took a year to create, and there's a lot of love that went into it. So an interesting challenge is to not only have the puzzle in the room and the mental challenge, but also create an atmosphere around it. And this is something you can't really tell until it's there and you get a feeling of the room, and then, also lean into the story. So I think that was an interesting one to find. It's kind of like, how can I create that? And, another one was, for instance, the puzzle where it came down to recreating a physical form into the digital game, where we had the idea of, bridging the digital game from the qualifiers with the physical game. And I thought the idea of the team to kind of like come up with a sculpture that has this form was brilliant. Funny thing was, that there was this idea of adding mirrors, but then you realized most players were not able to solve this, because it was just too hard for them. So we had to fixate some of the puzzle pieces so they can kind of like already have a sense of the structure. But even then, the idea of using a mirror kind of like was definitely beyond their capabilities. And this is another thing where, you kind of like need the physical representation and the learning from it to kind of like get a sense of that. And otherwise, I think it's quite impressive because we work on, a lot of escape rooms But with the design that came from the students and from Scott, I already know that we can fully trust on what's coming out of it, right? Even if people work on this and spend a lot of time on creating it, sometimes it's really being there and then, seeing if this is really true or not. And yes, it was true in almost all the cases. So congratulations to that.
So hearing that, it's interesting. They put a lot of faith in what we do. That we think here, we're designing this stuff on paper, we're making this stuff out of cardboard and wood. They're spending a lot of money to build these giant things with the trust that we've done our job. And that's why we have to do our job. And so congratulations to us to put that time. That's why we test. That's why we work. So that when they build it, they can be confident that, when their acrylic sheets broke and they didn't get those new sheets until 3 days before the event. And they're trusting that we did our homework, that we made this work, that they can build it out of our plans and it's going to work for them. That's good. That's why we do what we do. So this is the winning team from Slovakia, and we are going to see them. So the grand prize for the winning team is an all-expense-paid trip to Brantford, Ontario. Yay! They are coming right here at the end of June. And my plan is that any of you that are around that want to be a part of this, to involve our students who are part of the designers. What we're going to do is, so it's a 2-day event. The first day will be in Toronto at the Laurier headquarters there, doing some escape rooms there. The second day we're going to come here. My plan is that we're going to have a competitive escape room jam. So we're going to split the team and you all into 2 groups. You're going to be making an escape room for the other group. And the goal is to make an escape game that they will complete in as close to 20 minutes as possible. That's going to be the challenge. So you can't make it too easy, can't make it too hard, but that's going to be, it's right at the end of June, June 26th, around there, but the team's going to be coming here to Brantford, Ontario. So I wanted to give Shannon a chance to talk, because Shannon was there as well, to talk about what she did, what she observed, to talk about what she's been working on, because she's working on some cool stuff as a part of this. So Shannon?
All right, so I'm Shannon McDowell. I'm the Red Bull Research Associate. So my position has been funded by Red Bull to investigate cultural bias in escape rooms. So my goal with the World Championship was to ensure that the games were accessible for players from all different countries and cultures. So what that involved was partially language independence, making sure that there was no English or any other language in the game, which the designers already did a great job with. I also looked a lot at symbols used in the games. If there are symbols, like for example in the hints, making sure that those are things that are either recognizable to everyone from all the participating cultures, or making sure they're recognizable to no one. And that way everyone is on a level playing field. For example, you saw in the audio puzzle, those are all made up symbols. That's fine, because no one is going to recognize those, so there isn't any prior association with those symbols. Symbols can also be things like colors and sounds. So we wanted to have consistent notifications for players, like with hints. So a hint appears, a sound appears to notify players of hints, things like that. Colors were also important, and we had, last year, there were several players on some of the teams who were colorblind, and there were puzzles that required knowledge of colors. So this year, a lot of that was eliminated, but when I reviewed the design document, there was still the issue of, this puzzle isn't solved, so there's a red light on it. This puzzle is solved, there's a green light. Well, if you're colorblind, red and green is one of the most common kinds of colorblindness. So we changed the green lights to blue. And that was part of the rules that the players learned before they competed in the semifinals, is that blue was good, and red was bad or unsolved, and blue was solved. So that was interesting, and I did get feedback that helped players. And there's also not that association between red is stop, green is go in some countries. If you don't drive, you might not have that immediate recognition. And there's some countries that don't even use those colors to mean the same thing. So We had countries participating from all over Eastern and Western Europe. We had Russia, we had India, we had Brazil, we had the US. So that's quite a wide variety of cultures that had to be accommodated. That's also why the hints tended to be pictures or animations of what was going on in the rooms. It made it just a lot easier for every team to understand what they needed to do when it wasn't someone explaining something to them or a verbal hint. So those were the main things that I looked at for the championship games. What I've also been doing is research into cultural bias in escape rooms. So going to London was a great opportunity to speak to the teams, most of whom have played games in many different countries. I spoke to a couple people who have played over 1,000 games, 1,000 escape room games across, what was it, like 14 countries or something? That is a huge breadth of knowledge and something I really want to look at when I'm looking at the differences between escape room games and puzzles in different countries. So, some of the things that have come out, I've had a lot of really great stories about cultural differences where you wouldn't expect them. For example, who here knows your Roman numerals? Yeah? Okay, so what's 5 in a Roman numeral? V. Okay, what's 50?
V.
What's 500? Anyone?
Is this D?
I don't know.
Oh.
But,
Gotcha.
so in some countries in Europe, Roman numerals are considered such common knowledge that they will not give you hints in an escape room on a puzzle that involves Roman numerals. They expect you to know your Roman numerals, and if you say, oh, well, I don't know, can I get a hint? They'll be like, no. Where'd you go to elementary school? That is considered such common knowledge as the alphabet. So that was a very interesting difference that came up. You know, sometimes you see knowing chess pieces. That's a pretty common one. How does a chess piece move? Well, we know that some people don't play chess, but usually a room will have a clue as to how do you play chess. Roman numerals? No, you can't even get a hint on that in some rooms. So that's a big cultural difference. Another team had a very interesting story about a smell puzzle. So you had to smell some scents and identify what the scents were. And they were like, well, we don't know, like we're not from this country, we probably don't have the same references. And the GM was just like, no, you'll know it. Everyone knows these scents. Everyone, they're so common, everyone knows them, you don't need a hint. They're like, no, we don't know what these scents are. It turns out that the scents were 2 spices used in baking bread. The problem was, one of the team members is a baker and had never heard of the spices before, didn't even know the names of them. So that was some very specific cultural knowledge that probably everyone who lived in that country would know. But if you're coming from outside the country, you don't. So what I'm looking at is all these differences and how designers of escape rooms can eliminate that if they want players from other cultures and countries to participate. And what's come out of a lot of the interviews is I ask a lot about specific knowledge. So what specific knowledge have you encountered in rooms? Sometimes it's specific knowledge that they know. Like, oh, I know Roman numerals, so I could solve that puzzle. Sometimes it's specific knowledge that they didn't know, like the scents. But the common thread through a lot of these experiences is frustration. Whether they know the knowledge or not, players get frustrated with the room when it's knowledge that doesn't use puzzle mechanics to solve, when it's essentially trivia. So whether the room tells you how to use that trivia or not, it's frustrating, because if you know the answer and you just skip ahead and solve it, were you supposed to do that? Or were you supposed to wait for a puzzle that would tell you the answer? If you don't know it, and there is no puzzle to tell you the answer, you're stuck, and you can't get past it without a hint. And maybe you're waiting for the puzzle to tell you, but there isn't one, and you don't realize you're stuck. So far that's been a fairly common thread, and escape rooms are supposed to be fun. They're a form of entertainment. So my job is going to be to investigate this and maybe see what can be done to alleviate this frustration and to make sure escape rooms and escape room puzzles stay fun for the majority of players that play them. So that is what I do.
And Shannon has created a guide so far on media, making media for escape rooms, and the next step is to make a larger guide for rooms in general that want to make puzzles and challenges, how to make those without infringing upon people's cultural biases. So Konstantin is going to talk about sort of the wrap-up of the whole project.
So in terms of the event itself, in our understanding, things went really well. The cool thing was last year or 2 years ago, we did the first Escape Room World Championship, and we had to learn from scratch how this is going down. We ran qualifiers for 24 teams that took an hour with 2-minute breaks. That meant Scott and I had 24 hours of constant qualifiers, which was, I would say, an extreme sport for all of us. So we learned, and this year we knew what we get ourselves into. We planned differently. Of course, we also had to reduce the play experience in terms, for instance, of reducing time that players can spend in these rooms from 1 hour to 30 minutes, and also come up with certain structures, because the trickiest part is what do we do if something breaks down. Right, there is it takes us almost a month to plan the event in terms of logistics, in terms of kind of like how are we handling the teams, the staff that was involved. There were 40 people involved. Just being able to handle all of that, making sure that the teams are escorted, that they are entertained afterwards. So quite excessive. What went really well for us was, we this time also had per room one game master and then one judge. And this system allowed us to, on one hand, go in parallel. So that meant when a team comes in, they can play room 1 and 2. When they go into room 3, the next team is already starting room 1. This was something that we considered quite risky, but it turned out really well and doable. And in general, everything went smoothly. There were 1 or 2 hiccups, that something kind of like broke down. One team once thought that there was an error in the game, but there wasn't. And the feeling was that we were really it was good and easy for us to handle all these issues, and also that the 2 people that are involved in the room can make decisions and also can quickly repair stuff or check if it's doable or not. Therefore I think this part definitely went really, really well for us. I think from running the rooms, an interesting one is you also see when you run then a room, for instance, in this case, it was from 8 a.m. In the morning till 8 in the evening, with 23 teams, you also see how our puzzles behaving. And an interesting one was, when the idea of kind of like the first puzzle with a moving shaft, with the shuttle, we tested a room and it was easy. And then one of the last playtests we had a competitive enthusiast group in there. And what was interesting for us is suddenly to see the change of energy. So a puzzle that I would consider not, problematic suddenly turned out to be dangerous, because, they would kind of like push very hard or jump into the shuttle, and suddenly we realized, wow, we have a danger issue, a risk here. So we decided to have one of us pretty much stand in that room the whole day long, just to make sure that nobody gets hurt. And I think that's an interesting part that we also learned is, when people play competitively, they play differently. It's very hard for them to go into a story deeply. They are very concerned about their time. They want to be very fast. They don't really destroy things. They kind of like, that the time is kind of like the main issue. And therefore, we saw, for instance, that the room 3 where we had the cable idea, you can tell that this is a room that would suddenly start to break down. So we made it through the day, but I guess if we would have a second day, we would have to really replace all the equipment for that. So that said, we've learned that this format of running kind of like rooms through kind of like smaller portions, not a full hour escape room, but kind of like level by level, really works for a competitive tournament. And I think an interesting one would be in the future, maybe even doing more. Now we have 3 rooms, maybe a 4th or 5th room. And an interesting question that, maybe you guys want to discuss is also is our concept that we have these qualifier rooms for all the teams, 30 minutes, and then the top 2 teams go into the main room. And, I think for us, the core idea was also to kind of like give these 2 top teams room to play kind of like the full escape room experience. On the other hand, I think after doing this for 2 years now, I could also see maybe if you run a competitive escape room, it is a bit of a different thing. So maybe more focusing on these smaller rooms and maybe saying there are 4 or 5 of these smaller rooms and you go for kind of like a competitiveness between all teams in these 5 rooms and then have a high score list. Finally, an interesting thing was also scoring, because, for instance, we calculated a sum of all times. But for instance, let's say the Belgian team was the fastest in room 1 and in room 3, but were not good in room 2. While, for instance, the winner team even didn't fully finish one room. So an interesting question here is this the best way of measuring the time? So an interesting one could also be that you have a point system when you win a room. You kind of like, get certain points in the scoring system. So there could be also something to twist around here. But in general, we believe that we found an interesting system that can be developed further from this point on.
So what's happening next? If you want to see more of what went on when a social media team played the room, I did a live stream from the GM's quarters. And so if you can go to tinyurl.com/ScottRB2019, or it's on my Facebook space. You can watch that hour-long video where I torment the team as they work their way through the challenges. A lot of the footage you saw here and more footage was created to create into a TV show. So they're looking to pitch that out. So there'll be more rolling out from Red Bull in the future. And then the hope is that some of these elements are going to be brought together into an escape room in London that people can go and play. And so our stuff that we created will be able to live on. People that built these rooms run an escape room franchise in London and Edinburgh. So their intention is to make the Red Bull room so people can go and play our stuff. So that would be cool.
Well, and then finally, it was a great pleasure to work on the games and making sure that they get developed that you guys have created at the Brantford Games Network Lab, BGNlab, and I want to thank you all and also the Wilfdrid Laurier University for making this happen. I think it's very unique that a game gets created by so fresh minds as you guys, and I think one thing that definitely came out of this is that these puzzles that were created had a very interesting vibe to them and a quality where people understood that it really meant something that these were created. These were not just puzzles that, where you can kind of like go into the box and take one out. You could clearly tell that there was an interest in making sure that they fit a narrative, that they are, filmable, that they are interesting for the competitors to play. And everybody that saw the concept fully understood the complexity and the quality that got into it, and congratulations to all of you guys for making this happen, and also of course for Scott to being on board with this crazy project, and rest assured this is something that is not typical, and I think it's not something that somebody can just repeat because of the complexity, and I'm very proud to be part of it, and I'm very thankful that all of you spent time and energy onto this, and from the feedback we got from the players, they really loved it, and it was definitely something special that they will never forget. And so keep on making those games and stay playful. And I believe the games we create have meaning to a lot of people out there, and I think we need more of those. So all the best, and thanks so much. Best regards from Austria.
The photo they put out from after the thing, this actually fulfilled a lifelong dream of me. As a kid, I always wanted to be a game show host. And when they put out this picture, it's like, there we go, there's my game show host moment with my little question cards and the background and all that stuff. So this brings us to the end of what we wanted to chat about. And I wanted to open the floor to any questions or things that you are curious about. as far as everything that you've seen here, stuff that you didn't see here. Yeah.
Now I know hearing a bit more about the original idea and seeing you go literally around the entire escape room to show the entire process and that was because you were talking about AI identity in that. Was the ending that was in the final the original type of ending that you wanted to make, in that the players themselves become essentially an Omni 2.0? Like, did they know that the organization was starting to take a bad turn, or like, can you explain your thoughts?
Originally, the players had a choice. They actually had the ability at the end of the game to choose whether they were going to replace Omni or not. And so they did that last puzzle, and then at the end they could choose to either upload themselves or delete themselves and leave Omni there. So the original gameplay was an ethical ending the players had to make, whether they were going to leave Omni and leave themselves physically, or they were going to replace Omni with themselves. But it was felt that really wasn't right for a tournament type structure to have that ethical choice. But that was the original, is that you got to the end, you'd seen what was going on. There was more environmental storytelling to let you know that this was a bad guy, Kyle was a bad guy. And then you have the choice to fulfill your quest and free Omni, but the cost of that is leaving a copy of yourself in the system, or to not leave it and not free Omni and get yourself out of there and not fulfill the quest, but still finish the room. And then what would happen at the end is, rather than it be a firewall, it was going to be either Omni or the new Omni attack you and coming in at you on either side. So instead of it being generic firewall, there was actually a final challenge after those final screen-based puzzles, where the challenge was inside the set of screens, so the players had to move while the walls were coming in. There was going to be a broadcast with projectors, the Omni, either the bad Omni or their own Omni, attacking them as the security threat, and they had to rewire those screens in order to get out. So that was the original ending to the game.
With the game having the possibility of moving to a non-competitive setting, do you think the ethical choice at the end should go back in?
I don't know. It depends upon if they want to put language into it. I mean, if they bring English back into it, then that I think that opens up much more for storytelling than because that was a real constraint, was doing the storytelling without language. That was hard, especially in a competitive environment where people aren't really paying attention to details that don't matter, except for the clock. In that first room, in that interview chamber, there wasn't a lot to do other than push the next room. And the teams, every team ripped that little clock off the wall to the point that I began recording time to clock. Now, in the video game world, there is a thing called time to crate, which is how long in the video game you play until you hit something breakable that has a treasure within it. And so it's TTC, time to crate. So I started recording time to clock. How long before a team took that clock off the wall? The fastest was Team UK with 6 seconds. Time to clock.
Slowest?
Slowest was like a minute something. I didn't record it for a while, but there were some teams that didn't time to clock for a while. But the clock always ended, because I had to reset it. So I had to make sure that some teams would take the battery compartment out and change the time on it, because there just wasn't that much to mess with in that first room until they figured out to actually push a room. And so they'd mess with everything they could. So that brings us to the end of our adventure through behind the scenes at the Red Bull Escape Room World Championship. So thank you all for coming. It's been quite the journey, and keep an eye online so you can see more of the footage as it appears. Thank you.